Okay, this chapter looks at the psychology of athletic preparation and performance. So we've obviously up to this point looked at a lot of the important physical aspects of athletic preparation, but here we're going to look at the psychological side, and this is, again, probably just as important as the physical side of things. A lot of things to look at, particularly as it relates to athletics. Sports psychology is a pretty big field. You look at professional sports teams, most of them have a sports psychologist that they consult with. So a really important part of this. And obviously, to really have a handle on this, you need to be, a qualified professional in sports psychology. But again, even if you're not a sports psychologist, if you're dealing with athletic population, as a lot of you will be, or just even a physically active population in general, it's kind of important to see this because a lot of this stuff could even help, even if you're not dealing with, an individual who you'd classically think of as an athlete. Just if you're dealing with individuals in physical rehab, some of this information could help as far as just motivation and kind of understanding what the individual's going through. So the role of sports psychology basically has three major goals. And the three major goals are, one is just measuring psychological phenomena. So just being able to kind of get an objective view of what's going on psychologically and kind of how athletes handle things. The second one is investigating the relationship between psychological variables and performance, because we know there's a lot of connections with that. And then the third is applying theoretical knowledge to improve athletic performance, or just looking at what are ways through different forms of whether it be counseling or techniques that we could kind of leverage psychology to our advantage to kind of assist. And again, I'm saying athletic performance, but you could look at, again, if you're someone working, for instance, in an outpatient clinic, and maybe you're not working with professional athletes or even a high school or college athlete, just being able to work with someone who's injured, who probably was very physically active, because again, a lot of adults are very physically active, well into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and onward. Just being able to kind of get the psychology of that, because when individuals get injured, it obviously significantly impacts them. So looking at the ideal performance state, okay, so the ideal performance state is kind of the state that's marked by both psychological and physiological efficiency. So you kind of need both of those things really in order to kind of optimize performance. Okay, even if you're physically kind of at the top of wherever you need to be, if psychologically you're not there, it could provide a lot of distraction. And there's actually a lot of connection between psychological distraction and getting injured. So there's a lot of things that we could take into account with this. So the ideal performance state involves the following things. One is an absence of fear, and in particularly having no fear of failure. Another one is not thinking about or analyzing performance. Okay, a narrow focus of attention on the activity itself is another one. A sense of effortlessness. Okay, so not having to kind of think about what you're doing, you're just able to do it. And then, the last, another one is a sense of personal control. So you have personal control of what you're doing. And then a distortion of time and space, or a slowing of time. A lot of athletes who tend to be very good at their sport, there's the component where they say they could kind of slow things down. I mean, if you think about what goes on, during a football game or during a football play, there's a lot happening. Some of the best athletes, they could kind of take all of that, kind of slow everything down, and that kind of does that. So that distortion of time and space and getting time to slow down really kind of helps them, because they kind of see what's going on within the game and don't get distracted. So all of those things kind of all kind of tell you when someone's kind of performing in that ideal performance state. So just again, absence of fear, no fear of failure, not thinking about or analyzing their performance, a narrow focus on attention on the activity itself, a sense of effortlessness, a sense of personal control, and that distortion of time and space, or that being able to get time to slow down. So energy management, looking at arousal, anxiety, and stress, and kind of defining some of the things with this. The first thing we want to look at is just dealing with emotions. So emotions are basically temporary feeling states that occur in response to events that have both physiological and psychological components. So it's these feeling states based upon, how you're feeling, how you're thinking about things, okay? And they could have both a positive and negative impact, okay? So this positive or negative impact, again, it just kind of depends on how you control your emotions, which is very important. And it kind of depends upon, again, what it is that you're thinking about. We'll talk about different types of stress and how there's, both good stress and bad stress and how that can have both a positive or negative impact. Then we look at the concept of arousal. So arousal is a blend of physiological and psychological activation in an individual. Okay, so it refers to the intensity of motivation at any given moment. So it's, again, a blend of psychological or physiological activation. So when someone is high arousal, they've been activated somehow by that. And they actually could index this. So, and by index, we mean kind of basically measure it. You can measure it with heart rate. So think about it, when you're in a high stress state, what happens with your heart rate? Your heart rate tends to go up. Okay, so it's showing high arousal. Blood pressure, electroencephalography, electromyography. So they're showing, a high increase in nervous system activity. Catecholamine levels increase, okay? Now, the idea here is we always want arousal to kind of be optimal. So again, we don't want arousal getting to the point where it's too high, because obviously then that can be very physically distracting as well. And we don't want it to be too low, because we want to physically, because again, remember, there's a physical component of this along with the psychological. Part of the reason why some physiological arousal being a little higher in some instances is needed, because physically sometimes your body needs your heart rate to be higher to be able to carry out your activity. Then we look at anxiety. So anxiety is a subcategory of arousal that is going to occur during a negatively perceived emotional state. Okay, so anxiety is when we get a negatively perceived emotional state. Remember, again, emotions can kind of be positive, negative. Here we're looking at something that comes around with a negatively perceived emotional state. There's two different types of anxiety. There's cognitive anxiety. That basically represents the cognitive component, or things that you're thinking about. And then there's the somatic, which is basically the physical reaction. So when you hear the term somatic, it's referring to the structure of the body. Somatic anxiety are those physical things you feel with anxiety. So again, digestive upset is a very common thing that a lot of people experience that would be somatic anxiety, okay? Another kind of key point, that state anxiety is the actual experience of apprehension and uncontrolled arousal. So the different types of anxiety, which we're going to be talking about on the next slide, that go beyond even cognitive and somatic. You have state anxiety, which, as I just said, is the actual experience of apprehension and uncontrolled arousal. Trait anxiety is a personality characteristic, okay, which basically represents a latent disposition to perceive situations as threatening. So it's kind of like your personality and kind of how you kind of deal with those more threatening or stressful situations. So here's kind of a chart a little flow chart that you also see in your textbook. So you see with energy management, again, arousal, anxiety, and stress, they're showing the difference between trait anxiety and state anxiety. So again, state anxiety is a subjective experience of apprehension and uncertainty accompanied by elevated autonomic and voluntary neural outflow. It also includes increased endocrine activity. Now again, this is generally negative, but its effects on athletic performance can vary based on the individual. And you could kind of look and see kind of how the flow chart works with state anxiety as it relates to both cognitive state anxiety and somatic state anxiety. So cognitive state anxiety is moment-to-moment changes in worries and negative thoughts. Somatic state anxiety looks at moment-to-moment changes in perceived physiological arousal. Now, when we look at trait anxiety deals with the personality variable, or just kind of your disposition relating to the probability that one will perceive something as threatening. So again, some people, there you get the individuals that don't really view a lot of things as threatening. It's a personality trait that they have and therefore kind of don't really deal with it. But you see here trait anxiety, if you look on the chart, again, just kind of reiterates what I just said. An acquired disposition that predisposes a person to perceive a wide range of objectively non-dangerous circumstances as threatening and respond to these with disproportionate state anxiety levels. So if you're the type of person that gets anxious over a lot of things, and these can be things that in reality aren't threatening, it basically puts you in a position where you're going to experience negative state anxiety, okay? So it's the interrelationship of arousal, trait anxiety, state anxiety that will actually potentially causes problems, both in your personal life and in particular, it could carry into athletic performance. So state anxiety is the actual experience of apprehension and uncontrolled arousal. Trait is a personality characteristic, okay? So that kind of like sums those up. There's three important factors as it relates to arousal and anxiety. One of them is a very high ego, okay? So anything that could be possibly a threat to your self-esteem. A perceived discrepancy between one's ability and demands for athletic success. So if there's that, if you perceive that your ability maybe isn't as good as where your demands are, that could cause problems. And again, just the fear of consequences of failure can produce a very anxious individual. So again, all of those things could be things addressed, through different forms and different techniques to kind of reduce these negative issues in individuals. So we mentioned that, again, a lot of this comes back to stress. So stress is when there's a substantial imbalance between the demands and response capability. So again, particularly under conditions in which failure has important consequences. So again, we've all experienced stress in our lives. Again, if for some reason you see kind of an imbalance between, what you think you're able to do and what something's demanding of you, it's a very stressful situation, particularly when, again, there's major consequences or things are really important. Now, it's important to note that stress isn't necessarily always negative. There's also something called eustress. So two types of stress, you have eustress and distress, okay? Eustress is a positive stress, okay? Whereas distress is a negative stress, okay? So we all deal with different, think about what would make something a positive stress versus a negative stress, okay? So that would be important to look at. And in general, when we're talking about an environmental or cognitive events that precipitate stress, that's what's known as a stressor. So the stressor is essentially the cause of the stress that you're basically encountering. So we look at the influence of arousal and anxiety on performance. So again, there's a certain amount, we'll kind of talk about what it means to be kind of optimal with this. Again, we don't want arousal to be too low because that could possibly negatively impact performance as well. So we look at drive theory. So drive theory, and again, we're going to look at a bunch of different psychological theories as it relates to all of this. Again, you could kind of think about how it would kind of impact different individuals. So drive theory is a theory that as an individual's arousal or state anxiety increases, so does performance. So this just basically looks at, hey, if you're, as arousal increases, so too does performance. Now there's some caveats to that. One involves skill level. So when you're dealing with skill level, this could increase the latitude of optimal arousal. So in other words, the more skill somebody has, it'll correspond to better performance at levels other than optimal arousal. So in other words, if you have a really high skill level at something, you kind of have some wiggle room, if you will. You don't necessarily have to be at this optimal arousal point to perform well or to do something well. If you have really good skill, there's basically more room for error, I guess, if you will, as far as optimal arousal. And task complexity. So simple or well-learned skills can tolerate higher degrees of arousal due to kind of lower task-relevant cues for the athlete to monitor. In other words, simple skills, again, much like someone who has high skill level, if you're just dealing with simple skills, again, that arousal doesn't have to necessarily be quite as good, okay? Or doesn't have to be quite at that optimal point. Now, where a lot of people tend to go with this a slightly different theory is what's called the inverted U theory, and that's kind of what we're looking at here in these graphs on the side of the slide here, where the inverted U theory looks at arousal facilitating performance up to an optimal level, and then further increases in arousal are associated with reduced performance. So that's basically what you're seeing. If you look at this one right here, this is kind of the classic inverted U theory. So in other words, here's performance, here's arousal. So we have this optimal level of arousal where you're going to get peak performance. Anything if it goes higher and higher, you start to get kind of that, distraction that's going to occur with being at too high a level of arousal, and then you end up having issues with that. Now, as you kind of look, there's some other graphs kind of showing how, again, depending on the level of skill and the competence, whether you're introverted or extroverted, and whether you're dealing with a complex sport skill as opposed to a simple sport skill. So we're kind of blending these two theories a little bit. If you look at this slide here, we're dealing with someone with high skill and competitive experience versus someone with low skill. You notice how that shift kind of changes. Now the optimal level of arousal kind of drops a little bit because basically they're of low skill and competitive experience. They don't have as much room, whereas someone with high skill, so this kind of takes into consideration both the inverted U and also looking at the things we discussed with drive theory. Somebody with high skill level and competitive experience, they have a much broader range and a much higher level of arousal that they could kind of function with and still have high performance. If you look down here, different personality types, someone who's introverted versus someone who's extroverted. Okay, extroverted people have a tendency to be able to deal with arousal a little bit more. So an extroverted person is someone who's just more outgoing and everything. One's not necessarily better than another. It's just their personality traits kind of function a little bit differently. They could both have optimal performance, but someone who's introverted, as you can see, their arousal can't be as high. So that's something that you have to think about, again, just when you're dealing with different athletes or even injured patients. Whether someone's introverted or extroverted, sometimes motivating them could be a little different. Then if you look in the last one down here, the sports skill, again, complex sports skill, it got to be a little lower level of arousal typically to get the highest performance, whereas simple tasks, you get a little bit more room to operate at a higher level. So all of these things kind of interact when you're dealing with people. Again, this is just kind of the basic inverted U theory. But again, when you take into consideration all these other factors, there's some other things you have to consider when looking at what's going to be optimal for that individual. So still looking at arousal and anxiety on performance, again, taking it a little bit further, again, and this sort of ties into what we talked about, but this takes it a little bit more specifically to individual zones. So there's also the belief, and I think it does play a role, there's individual zones of optional functioning based upon the individual. So in other words, ideal performance doesn't always occur at a midpoint, okay? So different people perform best with very different levels of arousal. So rather than there being kind of a single defined arousal point, best performance can occur within a small range or bandwidth of arousal. Again, positive or negative emotions can both enhance or debilitate performance. So again, it just may be that different levels of arousal and different people will just function just based upon their personality types. We kind of did look at that a little bit on the last slide with whether someone's extroverted or introverted, but that could certainly be the case. There's something called catastrophe theory. That's when increases in physiological arousal occur in the presence of cognitive anxiety. Usually there's going to be a sudden drop in performance that's going to occur as opposed to a gradual decline. So again, if you're going to have this major increase in physiological arousal with a lot of cognitive anxiety, there's going to be this significant drop in performance. You need to clearly be delineated as cognitive anxiety, physiological arousal, somatic anxiety, or some combination of both. So again, this is just going to see a quick, very sharp decline in performance. And then there's the ideal of reversal theory. So this looks at the effect of how arousal and anxiety on performance depends on how they're interpreted, okay? So again, this comes back to individual differences between people. So one individual may interpret high level of arousal as excitement and feel ready to go, while another person may feel that same level of arousal and may interpret the feelings as unpleasant and reflective of lack of confidence. So in other words, you get the person who, let's just look at, and again, we'll just look at a athletics contest. You get the person whose heart rate is high, they have that, maybe the butterflies in their stomach, if you will, and that actually helps them. Whereas for someone else, they may perceive that as being negative, and they may perceive that as, possibly that they're experiencing too much stress, and it could do that. This theory also takes into account the fact that an individual has control over how anxiety and arousal affects them. So again, in other words, they can look at something as being positive or negative. In other words, the athlete or the individual has the power to reverse arousal and make it positive. So the reversal theory maybe looks at that person who maybe looks at those, again, the physiological phenomenon associated with anxiety, and maybe they view it as negative, but maybe through work and using some psychological techniques, they could turn that around and make it positive. So looking at the concept of motivation, so motivation deals with intensity and direction of effort. We've all kind of dealt with times where we've been highly motivated, not so motivated, but it just basically looks at the intensity and direction of effort. There's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivations, the desire to be competent and self-determining, so you have that intrinsic motivation to do well. Usually this person is a very good self-starter. They do things because they really want to do that. They have competence and self-determination, whereas extrinsic motivation comes from external sources. So awards, social approval, fear of punishment, they're two different things. Another form of motivation is what's called achievement motivation. So this is motivation is, an individual's wish to engage in something, to engage in competition or social comparison, and then whoever is higher in achievement motivation will a lot of times, be better at something because they kind of have that craving for competition, okay? So, and in reality, psychologically, we probably all have different levels of all of these things. Again, whether it's positive or negative. So obviously, extrinsic motivation isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's good for people to want to achieve awards and stuff like that, but it can also be negative from the standpoint of sometimes if you're a little, if it's more of fear of punishment or something like that, you'd have to look at psychologically, how individuals would achieve success through that type of belief.